Last winter, my friend Colin and I decided to spend a week in a remote cabin deep in Alaska's woods. It seemed like the perfect way to break away from the monotony of our small-town lives. The cabin was 2 hours from my house, secluded and nestled far from civilization. Colin had found it online, advertised as a peaceful retreat with stunning views and a wood-burning stove to keep warm. The thought of snowy trees and quiet evenings by the fire sounded idyllic. We packed our things, loaded up my truck, and set out early in the afternoon. The drive was uneventful at first, but the road narrowed as we neared the cabin, eventually turning into a trail cutting through endless forest. By the time we arrived, the sun was sinking below the horizon, casting long shadows over the snow. The cabin itself was small but cozy, with one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and an aging fireplace. Surrounding us were towering trees and an almost oppressive silence. After unpacking, we decided to explore the area before nightfall. The forest was eerily quiet, a silence so thick it felt alive, as if the trees were eavesdropping. Our boots crunched on the snow as we followed a narrow path winding through the pines. Then, we heard it, a scream. At first, it was faint, barely carried by the wind. Colin and I froze, exchanging uneasy glances. The scream came again, louder and unmistakably human, raw and desperate, making my stomach twist. "We need to check it out," Colin said, his tone firm. He was always braver, or more reckless, than I was. I wanted to pretend we hadn't heard it, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that someone needed help. We hurried toward the sound, our footsteps hurried and uneven. The screams grew louder, and soon we spotted a dim light through the trees. It came from a cabin, older and more dilapidated than ours, its windows grimy and roof sagging under snow. The light flickered, probably from a fire or lantern. As we got closer, the screaming stopped, replaced by muffled sobs or gasps. Colin signaled for me to hang back while he crept to a window. He scraped frost off the glass and peered inside. When he turned back to me, his face was pale and his eyes wide with shock. "There's a guy tied to a chair," he whispered, "and another man. He's wearing a mask. He's got a knife." I felt my blood turn to ice. My legs felt like they'd give out beneath me. Before I could respond, a voice came from behind us, sharp and startling. "What are you doing?" We spun around to see a tall man, broad-shouldered, standing just a few feet away. His heavy coat and hood shrouded his face in shadows, but his presence was unmistakably menacing. My heart pounded as his cold gaze locked on us. Neither of us spoke. Colin grabbed my arm, and we bolted. The man yelled something, but we didn't stop. Snow blurred past as we ran, our breath fogging in the freezing air. I could hear his footsteps pounding behind us, relentless. We reached our cabin, slamming the door and locking it with trembling hands. For a moment, we just stood there, gasping for breath. Then, we killed the lights and peered out the window. The forest was still, the only sound the wind through the trees. Colin grabbed his phone and called the authorities. It felt like an eternity before their flashing red and blue lights pierced the darkness. We met the officers outside, shivering as we recounted the night, the screams, the man tied up, the masked figure, and the one who had chased us. They seemed skeptical but agreed to investigate. We led them back to the old cabin, flashlights cutting through the shadows. When we arrived, my stomach dropped. The place was empty, no light, no screams, no sign of anyone. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Inside was nothing but an empty, dust-covered room and a broken chair in the corner. The officers promised to continue their search and told us to stay inside for the night. Sleep eluded us, my mind haunted by the masked man and the chilling silence of the forest. 2 days later, the police called. They said they had caught the men, but details were scarce. The officer on the phone sounded uneasy, warning me not to press for more information. "It's better if you don't know," he said. We left the cabin that same day. The forest, once a serene retreat, now felt sinister, its secrets pressing heavy on my chest. Even back home, I can't shake the memories, the screams, the chase, the masked man. Questions linger, unanswered and haunting. Who were those men? Why was one of them being tortured? The authorities never shared the full story, and maybe it's better that way. It was January 2019, and I was living in a quiet neighborhood in California. That winter was unusually cold, and the news had been warning us about a rare heavy snowstorm. Snow wasn't something I associated with California, so seeing everything blanketed in white that night felt surreal. It was as though someone had painted the entire world with a frosty brush. My bedroom was on the second floor, and I woke up around 3 a.m., feeling groggy and needing to use the bathroom. The house was completely still, the kind of silence that feels dense, as if the snow outside was absorbing all sound. As I sat up and swung my legs off the bed, I glanced toward the window to check how much snow had accumulated. Earlier in the evening, I had been eager to see how the neighborhood would look under a thick layer of snow. When I pulled back the curtain, I was taken aback. The snow was deeper than I had ever seen, smooth and untouched, piled high past the curb. The streetlights reflected faintly off the pristine surface, giving everything an ethereal glow. It was stunning, almost magical. There were no cars, no people, just the serene stillness of the snowy night. After using the bathroom, I decided to head downstairs to grab a drink of water. The cold tiles of the bathroom floor sent a shiver through me, but I didn't think much of it. As I walked down the stairs, the familiar creak of the steps broke the silence. In the kitchen, I turned on the light, grabbed a glass from the cabinet, and filled it with water. The house felt unusually empty, a hollowness I attributed to the snowstorm and its quieting effect. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the bright light. That's when I heard it, a soft, distinct click. The sound came from the direction of the front door. My first thought was that it might have been the wind pushing a branch against the house. The storm outside was intense, so it seemed plausible. Dismissing it as nothing, I turned off the light and headed back upstairs. The stairs groaned softly underfoot as I returned to my room. Before settling back into bed, I glanced out the window again. This time, something was different. Footprints. Fresh tracks marred the untouched snow. They started near the edge of my driveway, close to the house, and trailed off toward the neighbor's backyard. My heart raced as I stared at them. I had just looked outside moments earlier. How could someone have walked there so quickly without me hearing anything? I leaned closer to the window, squinting to see if the tracks looped back or went further. They didn't. They disappeared behind the neighbor's house, as if the person had vanished into thin air. A strange unease settled over me, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just a teenager playing in the snow or someone cutting through to their yard. I told myself it wasn't worth worrying about, though the nagging sense of something being wrong lingered. The next morning, I came downstairs to find my parents in the living room, visibly upset. My mom was sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly, while my dad paced back and forth. "What's wrong?" I asked, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. My dad stopped pacing and looked at me. "Your mom's gold jewelry set is missing," he said grimly. The set was precious, not only expensive but deeply sentimental, a gift from my dad to my mom on their anniversary. She rarely wore it and kept it in a small wooden box in their bedroom. "How?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We don't know," my dad said. "We didn't hear anything, but it's gone." That's when I remembered the footprints. My heart pounded as I described what I had seen the night before, the fresh tracks in the snow leading from our house toward the neighbor's backyard. My dad frowned and suggested we check the security cameras we had installed around the house. We rushed to the small monitor and rewound the footage to the time I had gone downstairs for water. At first, everything seemed normal. The front door camera showed nothing but snow falling steadily. The backyard camera was similarly uneventful. Then, my dad switched to the footage from the kitchen. We froze. The video showed me walking into the kitchen, turning on the light, and pouring myself a glass of water. But in the corner of the screen, near the doorway to the dining room, there was movement. A man. Tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes, he stood perfectly still, partially hidden by the doorframe. His head was tilted slightly, and he was watching me, watching the entire time I was in the kitchen. A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't noticed him at all. My mom gasped, covering her mouth, while my dad cursed under his breath. We rewound the footage again and again, but the man's face was too blurry to make out any details. The camera quality wasn't good enough. The man must have slipped out while I was heading back upstairs. Perhaps the soft click I heard had been the front door opening and closing. We called the police immediately. When they arrived, they examined the footage and confirmed that it wasn't clear enough to identify the intruder. The officers checked outside, but a fresh wave of snow had covered the tracks, erasing any evidence. The police advised us to secure our home better, lock all doors and windows, and upgrade our cameras, but there was little else they could do. They had no leads and no answers. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about that man. How long had he been in our house? Had he been watching me the entire time? And what might have happened if I had noticed him? It was December in Minnesota, and the world outside was blanketed in about a foot of snow. The air was hushed, the kind of silence that only deep snow can bring, muffling every sound in the neighborhood. My parents were out at a bar, and my brother was spending the evening at a friend's house, leaving me alone in the house. I didn't mind, I enjoyed the quiet. Wrapped in a blanket, I was curled up on the living room couch, watching a show on TV. The soft glow of the screen illuminated the room, while the rest of the house remained in shadow. The steady ticking of the clock on the wall marked the passage of time as I settled deeper into the couch, enjoying the stillness. I had just polished off a bag of chips when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic knocking sound coming from the basement. At first, I thought it was the old pipes. The house had its quirks, and winter often brought out all kinds of groans and creaks. But this sound didn't quite match the usual noises, it was deliberate, soft yet consistent. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and made my way to the basement door. The floor felt icy under my socks, and the air seemed heavier as I approached. My hand hesitated on the doorknob before I turned it, flipped the light switch, and peered down the stairs. The basement light flickered briefly before stabilizing, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. Cautiously, I descended the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The faint smell of dust and old cardboard greeted me at the bottom. I scanned the room, the boxes in the corners were stacked neatly, papers covered the old desk as they always did, and plastic bins lined the far wall. Everything appeared untouched. I walked around, checking the small windows for any sign of movement or a draft that might have caused the sound. But there was nothing, just the cold, still air of the basement. Shrugging it off as my imagination or snow shifting against the house, I climbed back upstairs, shut the door, and returned to the couch. Just as I started to relax again, a loud crash shattered the silence. It came from the basement, followed by what sounded like a door slamming. My heart leaped into my throat as I sat upright, staring at the basement door. This wasn't a noise I could brush off. It was sharp, deliberate, and unmistakable, like something heavy being overturned. After a moment of hesitation, I stood up. The house felt different now, as if the shadows had deepened, and the quiet had turned oppressive. My hands were clammy as I approached the basement door. Trying to steady my voice, I called out, "Ryan, is that you?" No response. I called again, louder this time, but the only answer was the faint hum of the basement light. Swallowing hard, I opened the door and started down the stairs once more. The air felt colder this time, and the light flickered ominously as I reached the bottom. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. The desk drawers were pulled open, papers scattered across the floor. Boxes that had been stacked neatly earlier were toppled, their contents spilled out. The plastic bins had been overturned, their lids lying haphazardly nearby. It looked as if someone had been searching for something. But the most chilling sight was the back door. It was wide open, cold air spilling into the basement and fogging up the glass. Snow had drifted inside, forming a thin layer on the floor near the doorway. Leading out into the night were fresh footprints, crisp and deep in the snow, disappearing into the darkness of the backyard. I froze, my thoughts racing. Someone had been in my house, someone had been in the basement while I was sitting just upstairs, completely unaware. The realization made my skin crawl. I rushed to the door, slammed it shut, and locked it, my hands trembling as I fumbled with my phone to call my parents. My mom answered, her voice immediately concerned as I tried to explain what had happened. She told me to stay put, and they'd come home right away. When they arrived, my dad grabbed a flashlight and went outside to follow the tracks. My mom stayed with me, keeping a reassuring hand on my shoulder. I listened as my dad's boots crunched through the snow, the sound fading as he moved further into the yard. When he returned, his expression was grim. "The footprints stop at the road," he said. "Looks like whoever it was got into a car and drove off." The police arrived shortly after. They combed through the basement, taking notes and checking for signs of forced entry. But the door hadn't been broken, it had simply been unlocked. My dad swore he had locked it earlier, but maybe it hadn't latched properly. The officers suggested it was likely a random burglary, someone who thought the house was empty. But as I replayed the scene in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The way everything had been rifled through so thoroughly made it seem personal, as though they were looking for something specific. Even now, I can't forget the sight of those footprints leading into the snowy night, or the unsettling thought that someone had been in my home, searching, while I was blissfully unaware.